reputation is being understood in ways that it hasn't really ever before. I mean, this is a moment for communicators. And I think that's really, really important as we think about structures of organizations and what it looks like to lead from the communications seat. And part of that is because the risks that have been proposed and really kind of put in front of us by this technological advancement, the information proliferation we've talked about, the speed and the pace, it actually works for us as much as or more than it works against us. We no longer have to say, oh, well, we don't have time to tailor a message to our employees because this news is moving fast. Well, actually now we do. Let's take that external communication we've put out to talk to a reporter and very quickly tailor that to make sure that our employees understand this information and get it first based on meeting them where they're at.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership. My guest for this episode is Bradley Akubuiro. He's a partner at Bully Pulpit International, where he leads the firm's corporate communications practice. A globally recognized expert on corporate reputation, Bradley is the kind of person executives put on speed dial when their world is on fire. Bradley previously served as chief spokesman and head of global media relations at Boeing, where he led communications through the 737 MAX recovery and the COVID pandemic. Earlier, he ran public affairs for the $77 billion United Technologies Corporation. He was a management consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton, a policy advisor to Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., and a governance reform consultant to the Republic of Liberia after 14 years of civil war. Bradley writes a regular column for Inc. magazine and teaches at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. His new book is titled Faster, Messier, Tougher: Crisis Communication Strategies in an Era of Populism. Bradley Akubuiro, welcome to Leadership.
Roger, thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to this. Now, you open your book with a teenage story about walking through your neighborhood and learning not to, in your words, get caught slipping. How did that street-level instinct for scenario planning become the foundation of how you do crisis communications?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One, when I think about this concept of not getting caught slipping, I think this applies to so much, but I will say the way that I learned the concept was when I was in the neighborhood. There was a particular situation. I had a good friend who I knew was trouble. My parents particularly knew he was trouble, but he had these charismatic qualities that just were so magnetic. And so I spent time around him whenever I could. And he had actually taken us out to go play basketball. And after we were heading back to his apartment, and one of our friends, his roommate, had been killed just before we'd gotten there. Some folks had kicked in the door and shot up the apartment. And so we weren't there, but we got there quickly. And I think part of the scariest thing in that moment is, man, just a few minutes separation, and that could have been me. It could have been us. And so the first question you ask yourself is, how do I get out of this situation immediately? The second question you ask yourself is, am I compromised? Is there somebody who's still nearby who's, putting my life at risk, or who is thinking about what they might do to us next? Did they see us come in? Did they, have us marked? Did they know that we're together and know each other? Is it someone who's out to get us, or was this just coincidence? And so when you think about all of these things, your mind immediately starts going to, how do I put myself at the greatest odds of safety? How do I remove as much risk from the scenario as I possibly can? And you think about this in every scenario when that's your environment. And I would say, in a corporate setting, we have to think about things through the same kind of risk lens, but it was ingrained in me almost as second nature growing up. And I think that's one of the things that's helped make me sharper as a professional and not taken away from my experience.
Well, walking into the corporate world, you were surprised by how few executives understood basic risk assessment. Why is the corporate brain so unprepared for the kind of constant vigilance that your earlier life forced on you?
We often have a different set of incentives and a different set of kind of realities, right? We find ourselves in corporate settings actually rewarded by finding ways to navigate a bureaucracy. How do we deal with big kind of complex, slow-moving organizations? How do we do the things that are going to motivate the folks who are stakeholders in that organization to move in a direction when everybody is kind of, moving in a slightly different direction? Those things are really, really important skills, but it actually disincentivizes quick movement, right? When we think about the type of scenario planning that I'm describing, usually it's around something that's an immediate risk. It's something that will kick into our fight or flight, senses. And so when you're thinking through those types of things, there is a premium on preparation. There's a premium on being nimble. There's a premium on being able to see a risk and avoid a risk very quickly. And sometimes that's preemptive strike. Sometimes that is, let's flee. And those types of things are not natural for organizations with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in the case of Boeing or some of the other companies I've worked with. And we've really got to be able to figure out, how do we simplify the mechanisms to get to a solution? And how do we bring the right people along, but not everybody in a massive bureaucratic construct into the conversation?
Oh, sure. Well, now you've worked with Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., the Liberian government, Boeing, and United Technologies, and many other places. What common threads seem to tie these experiences together?
There are a few things that really stand out to me. One, each of the folks that you've kind of named, the president of Liberia at the time was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who is fantastic and went on to win a Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to bring the country together. Reverend Jesse Jackson, rest in peace, who is a great unifier in many ways as we think about the many kind of forms of discrimination and polarization we've seen, not only here in the United States, but around the world. When you think about things that have really made these folks stand out, they are incredible communicators who are particularly exceptional at articulating a very compelling vision and helping people understand the steps that are required to achieve the outcome that they've outlined. And I think that's important because all of us as leaders at any scale really have to think about, what is the action or behavior that we are trying to achieve with the people we're trying to move? And that's the first consideration. And everything that comes after that has got a letter back to it. And so if you are able to be thoughtful, whether it's a moment of crisis, a moment of transformation, or any other kind of leadership crucible moment, we've got to say, for the people who we need to respond or take a certain action in this circumstance, what's the thing that we need them to understand about what we need them to do, what we're trying to be or where we are trying to go, and what their role is in that process. And if we can do that effectively and repeatedly, we're probably going to end up with a much better outcome in any of these scenarios.
Sure. Well, and you've learned, as we all would, in every place you've been, and you continue to learn. You're not going to stop learning.
I hope not.
And every time you work with a new client, you're reminded of what works and what doesn't work.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So, Bradley, you make the case that we've moved from an age of impact to an age of issues, and that crisis communications has become indistinguishable from corporate communications. What does that mean for how CEOs should think about their job description today?
Yeah, well, I think it's been really easy for CEOs and boards to put reputation into a bucket that is kind of a nice to have, right? When you think about the moment that we're in, whether it is Coca-Cola losing, missing $410 million in revenue last year when they had to go to the earnings after a boycott around a piece of disinformation that really hurt them in the LATAM market, or if it's, you think about the challenges that Bud Light's had around some of their issues, If you think about Target and some of the challenges that they've had, there are real business consequences to not getting these answers right. And I think boards are waking up to this as a real business resilience question and risk mitigation. And so what we have to think about is, how do we actually operationalize and structure our organizations to be able to operationalize reputation as a lever of business success or potential harm rather than a nice to have kind of vanity metric?
Well, yeah, and it reminds me that CEOs and other leaders need to deal not just with the culture inside their organization, but with the cultures outside the organization. They can't divorce themselves from reality.
Yeah.
So why are crises today faster, messier, and tougher than those of a decade or so ago?
Yeah, there are three things that really sit with me when I think about that question, Roger, and it's such an important one. One is a matter of polarization. We are more divided than we've been at almost any time.
Yeah.
Right? You feel it in every interaction. You even feel it in conversations with people around you, but people are so divided. And so polarization has really increased, and we'll come back and talk about that in a second. But the second is weaponization. You are actually seeing that bad actors have both more incentive and better tools to be able to do harm to us and to our brands than they've had at any other time in recent memory as well. And the final one is information proliferation. Right? When you think about all of the sources, I mean, nearly 50% of the folks who are under the age of 30 are getting their information almost exclusively off TikTok, right?
Right. That's scary.
All right, we'll leave that one there.
Yeah.
But when you think about all of the sources that people get their information from, and let's actually say, one click deeper on this, people are forming opinions about you or your brand not only faster, but increasingly, exponentially higher rates. They are not actually looking at your website or the site of any news source at all. You can plug something right into ChatGPT or any kind of LLM and say, what is the answer to question A? And it will tell you based on its aggregation of sources what the answer is. And people are actually not clicking on nearly as many websites to inform their worldview or thinking. And so that's not a judgment of whether this is good or bad, but it is different. And it means that the way we need to communicate in these moments has to reflect the way that people actually receive information and form opinions in this moment.
Well, you described the COVID era pendulum, the swing that we saw in employee power, the great migration, the rise and fall of DEI, and the labor reset, all these things. Why does the corporate world keep getting blindsided by these pendulum swings?
Well, this kind of goes back to the bureaucratic piece, right? When you're thinking a little bit about organizations, we have actually rewarded over time this concept of being slower and a little bit more cautious, right? How do we stop and get the best information that we can? And how do we kind of build a case around that as we're thinking through, how we operate? We take long times to build structures around the way things are today. We put a lot of money and resources into it. And then what ends up happening is the world changes around us and we're actually standing still. And so when you think about the organizations that are the most successful in these moments, it's the ones who actually have some type of radar built in to understand the shifts in culture, the way that people are kind of interacting with the world around them and saying, all right, how do we actually keep not only a pulse on that, but a reflection of that in the work that we do? And what does that look like? I think consumer brands are a little bit quicker to do these things. But I think overall, we've got to figure out a way to actually build this into our system. And so I take this question, for example, of DEI, right? It was apparent to us probably 24 to 36 months ago that the tide was changing pretty significantly. There was conversation around the affirmative action statutes that would probably end up seeing the Supreme Court. We knew that these things were coming, and I think organizations watched it and said, let's monitor. And what they should have been thinking about is, what are the policies we have in place that have the ability to be impacted should this go to the end result? How do we actually figure out the areas where we are most vulnerable as organizations? And all of us have vulnerabilities, Roger, both as brands and as individuals. I know I sure do. Instead of actually trying to cover those things up, we've got to lean into them and understand them better and then figure out what are the things we need to do to inoculate ourselves against attack in these areas or the world changing around us in these spaces, and then be able to say, in this scenario, here's how we're going to approach this, and here's how we actually preserve the things that matter in these contexts versus these are the things we can actually let go.
Well, be proactive rather than reactive.
Yes.
And how about some scenario planning?
Right.
So, yeah.
That's right.
Oh, duh.
Yeah. Well, and on that point, we can't just put the scenario plans in a book and then dust it off when the moment comes.
Right.
You know? To your point, you've really got to operationalize some of this stuff by sitting down, working through it, having hard conversations during peacetime so that when you actually get to these moments of chaos, instead of just watching the world break around you, you say, we know what to do because we've actually tested this out. And we may not have had every single factor 100% lined up, but maybe we've got a 60% solution. And boy, will that save you a lot of time in a moment of chaos.
Yeah. Well, now, Bradley, you write that fear, not rage, drives most divisive reactions. Why does understanding the underlying fear change the way a company should communicate?
Yeah, well, fear is a really, really powerful motivator. When you think about, for example, this conversation around AI, it has become apparent in the last couple of years that AI is here to stay. When you think about the types of people who are kind of exposed to this information and trying to make sense of what that means for them, you are either going to believe that this is going to be helpful to you and it's going to exponentially increase your ability to do your job and be successful, not only in this immediate sense, but take you to places that you wouldn't have been able to go before. So you're going to see this as a catalyst, or you're going to think it's going to take your job. It is going to displace you in society, and it's going to actually create a situation where you may not know how to provide for your family because this technology has taken your livelihood. And if you're looking at Block, that reduced its workforce by 40%. If you're looking at, so many companies that have actually created these AI, redundancy targets and are starting to eliminate employees, your employees are making determinations about what they think you are going to do with AI, whether or not you talk about it. And so when we talk, Roger, about inoculation and really understanding where we're vulnerable, we are all vulnerable on this question of actually what is our plan and how do our employees fit into that? And if we're not talking about it to them, they're making assumptions, and their assumptions are almost never going to be helpful to our outcomes. And so when we think about this, and it's across so many different lanes, it's across, I talk about these 5 fault lines and the divides around them. I talk about the technological divide, the economic divide, the information divide, the institutional trust divide, and the technology divide, which we just talked about with this AI example. You are finding that there are people on both sides of these issues, and the way they see the world is diametrically opposed from one side to the other. And if we're not careful about how we communicate, we are going to be walking right into a hornet's nest with each one of these issues, and you're much more likely to catch yourself in a viral situation. But more importantly, you're going to lose trust with key swaths of your stakeholder set.
And all of this is moving faster than ever before. Now, Bradley, you're sharp on the so-called outrage industry, that the policing of language created the pressure cooker that fueled cancel culture, and now it's backlash. Where should companies sit in that crossfire?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think companies have a tendency, and I say companies, but really its leaders have a tendency to do what's in vogue. And so you think about the backlash to companies post George Floyd, for example. Mm-hmm. And so many companies did very performative things. I don't know if folks remember the black squares that people would actually, put up on their Twitter handles and all of these things.
Right.
And a lot of this was just very much in response to show some level of solidarity, sure, but also because there was a consumer expectation that you were doing X or Y. And so what's interesting, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is organizations have to be thoughtful about what is it that actually aligns with what I truly value as an organization, both your values and your strategy. And you need to really focus on what are the things that I do that are mission aligned when it comes to being out public and talking about things, not just what's in vogue, but what reinforces who we are as an organization. Because it really actually doesn't matter what you say on Tuesday. What matters is what people see from you over time. Are you clear in your convictions, and do you stand by them in these times that matter? I say this all the time, but you actually have to figure out where you stand and then actually stand there. There is nothing more important.
And stay there.
That's right. That's exactly right. You have to, because people will look back and they'll say, I don't remember the specific thing that this company said or this leader has said. I've heard them talk a handful of times, but one thing that I do know is I've always felt like they've been consistent on issue X, right? They've always supported this community or this cause, or whenever they're talking, their strategy reinforms Y. And I think that really for us as leaders, we have to think about what are the things that we want people to know if they know nothing else about us and our organizations and our values and our strategy. And we have to really find ways to say, all right, everything that we say and do has to reinforce that. Our alignment between our words and our actions has to reinforce that. And then our consumers, our investors, our policymakers know how to make sense of us in the world.
Well, let's look at a case like Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel tried to quietly modernize its logo and quietly scrub its DEI pages, and they ended up alienating everyone. Why does quiet appeasement almost always fail?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the organizations that have found themselves in trouble, particularly around cultural issues in this time, it's almost always been folks who have taken a stand on something. And usually it's, for market-based reasons. They knew that they wanted to actually increase their market share with a younger audience that had slightly different views. And if you look, there was nothing radical about the changes that they made,
Yeah, seriously.
Right. But, they took this stand. They knew why they did it. They did the market research. They understood what they had to gain from it. And they didn't actually, when the moment came and they received some backlash, stand by it. And what's fascinating to talk about kind of the tools that bad actors can use against you, most of the initial outrage that they received in backlash, that suggested that they were forgetting the audience that brought them to where they were at and that they were going woke, all of these things, it actually started off pretty significantly driven by bots. I mean, these weren't even people that initiated this. And so, when you think about this, a lot of the fur built up, and it became an issue over time when some of the folks who are out there, including at some point the president of the United States, saw this and said, let's make this a talking point issue. And that happens more and more these days.
Yeah.
But there was a point at which the organization had the ability to actually, say, hey, how much of this is real and how much of this is our core audience or the audience we're trying to grow with, and how much of this is actually noise, right, that we don't need to respond to. And two, if this is a true area of vulnerability for us, right, we know our core audience may see this and think we're walking away from them. What is our plan to very quickly nip that in the bud? How do we actually take a really decisive and bold statement or action to dismiss that point of view, but without tossing out our plan, because it was part of our strategy to grow? And so how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, that was an interesting case study. I've been to Cracker Barrel, and I always feel like I'm at an AARP national convention when I'm there. And during all that turmoil, I told myself, I really doubt that their core audience, they're not the people who are online doing all this complaining. They're probably not spending a lot of time on TikTok.
That's right. Have a little conviction.
Yeah.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Now, you write that people can accept disagreeing with you, but what they will never accept is hypocrisy. How can CEOs test their decisions against that standard before making them public?
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult thing. And, on the cover of my book is an endorsement from Reverend Jesse Jackson, who, as you noted, I worked with for a number of years. And he talks about how conviction still matters and trust can still be earned. And that's a really core theme that I try to hit on, because when you are thinking about the things that your communities, your employees, your investors, your policymakers are thinking about when they're assessing how you've operated, both in the marketplace and as a corporate citizen, they're asking themselves, well, what are the things that we generally know about this organization? And does this action, whether it is a crisis moment or it is just an important decision that your organization has made, does it align with what we think we know about them, right?
Yeah.
And, I'll say this, and because, we're talking about kind of conviction, what we have seen is a number of organizations who, particularly around the introduction of many policies over the last, 15, 16 months with this new administration, have forced organizations to look at the policies that they have and say, do we want to tune up? Do we want to tune down? Do we want to move away from things that we have really kind of talked strongly about in the past? And there is probably no more salient example than the DEI example, right? If you look at Target, for example, they've lost since January of 2025, about $12 billion in value. Their foot traffic has significantly declined in stores. And a lot of that is attributed to the boycotts that took place of the brand after they rolled back some of their outward-facing DEI policies. And it's really important to examine case studies like this, because the reason why Target was such a great candidate for these boycotts and the impact that it's felt is because Target, unlike, John Deere or Tractor Supply, had a history of standing with communities of color and LGBTQ plus communities, including having, Black-owned businesses on their shelves. And when they actually made a change, people felt betrayed. They felt like this particular thing that you've always said matters to you and that you've been a leader on, all of a sudden is something you don't care about as soon as it's inconvenient to care about it. And so when you have that backpedaling, you end up in a situation where people see you as a hypocrite, and that is something that they just cannot countenance. And so I would, encourage every company to find that level of conviction and consistency in those convictions, because your stakeholders believe a certain thing about you. And when you shatter that belief, it shatters their trust in multiple different ways. And Target will find that some of the customers that were the most loyal to them prior to this may never step foot in their store again.
Yeah, and people have long memories.
They sure do.
Well, now, you argue that in a real crisis, you don't want the friendliest reporter. You want the toughest, credible reporter. Why is that counterintuitive choice so important for restoring trust?
Yeah, I think about this even in the context of Boeing, right? When I was leading the media relations team at Boeing, one of the things that we would think about is we have 70,000 employees in the state of Washington, or Boeing has about 70,000 employees in the state of Washington. We had a number of situations where we both needed to convince the public of something important. Like, for example, after the 737 MAX incidents, we had a number of different operational changes that needed to be made to ensure that the way that we operated within facilities reflected all of the quality suggestions, safety suggestions, et cetera, that would make us more efficient, more effective, and really inspire a level of confidence in our process that we needed in order to ensure that something like the 737 MAX accidents could never happen again. And so in doing that, there was a really, really high bar to ensuring that people understood that those changes were real and that they were felt and that they were concrete. And so yes, we could go to our friendliest reporter and say, help us tell this story and, tell everything. But, the thing about it is people see that and they say, every time so-and-so writes a story about Boeing or writes a story about your organization, it's always a fluff piece. It's always, exactly what you want to say. And I don't trust that.
They're throwing softballs.
Yeah, they're throwing softballs. Nobody trusts that. They want someone who's going to really put the screws to you. And if that person comes out with what feels like a balanced article that says these guys are actually doing these things and here are still the risks, but it seems like they're actually making steps in the right direction, that is a home run because you were able to go and tell the folks who are reading that there's nothing that's left. There's no stone unturned here, and you can see it because even our greatest critics or most scrutinizing audiences are seeing that. And I brought up the employees that we had in Washington State to say that is a core audience, right? You need people, your employees are either going to be your greatest ambassadors or your most credible detractors, right? And you've got to bring them on this journey with you. And so as you think through that, we knew that we could put some things out on our employee intranet that maybe they would read or maybe they wouldn't read. But what they're really going to care about is when they see us talking about it externally and they see us talking about it with Dominic Gates of the Seattle Times, for example, who won a Pulitzer on reporting on our company, which means he wasn't throwing a lot of softballs.
Right.
They know that we mean it. And they know that if we're actually backtracking on anything we've said, he's going to find that out. And so there is a level of trust that's inspired by that that's really critical.
Well, that reminds me, you introduced what you call the backyard barbecue test. How many questions it takes a stranger to find out where your employee works and how they describe the experience. What's a result that should genuinely alarm a CEO with the backyard barbecue test?
Yeah, well, Roger, you explain it well, right? If you go to a backyard barbecue or if you're fancy and you go to a cocktail party, right, it works the same way. And you meet somebody new and you talk to that person. And first the question you ask is, well, what do you do? There are many ways a person can answer that question. The way you hope they answer that question is, hi, I work at Bully Pulpit International and I do this work to help CEOs navigate the times that we're in. Great. That's fantastic. I might want to hear more about that, or I might want to move on to, something else, the food, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But you very clearly get that answer because that employee's demonstrated that they have pride in the organization and they see how they fit into the work that's done, right? And increasingly, people want to have a mission and want to feel that they are part of something that's bigger than themselves as part of their work. So those things are critical. If, however, you ask that person and they say, well, I work in communications. And you're like, well, what's communications?
Yeah.
And you start to get into it, and it takes 3 or 4 or 5 questions to really understand what they do and who they do it for. That's not just the function of that employee not knowing how to articulate it. There is something that has to be examined about how much does that employee see themselves in your organization and what you're trying to accomplish and what it means for them and their identity, right? Because at the end of the day, this is about employee identity and whether the identity of their employer actually lines up with how they want to see themselves in the world. And as a CEO, as a head of HR, as a head of communications, what you really have to focus on these moments as you're creating and really cultivating culture is, do employees believe that they're better off for their association with us than they would have been without us? And if the answer to that question isn't resoundingly yes, then we've got work to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's go back in time. In 1968, and you wouldn't remember that, you're too young, but I remember it well. In 1968, the average TV soundbite was 42 seconds. Today, it's 9 seconds. In this age of short attention span, how do thoughtful leaders produce sharp sound bites without dumbing themselves down?
Yeah. This is always tough because at some point, I think we're going to get a chance to smile, and that's going to be the end of it.
Yeah.
But realistically, people's attention spans are so short now because of that proliferation of information we talked about. There are so many inputs coming in at any given time from so many different sources that people need to actually just understand what is your key point. And either I'm going to agree with that I'll disagree with that, but it's one input and I'm moving on to the next thing, right? Because our mind can only take so much. And so we are trying to synthesize this information all the time, right? And so
Right.
when I'm thinking about this moment where we're saying, all right, 9 seconds to get our message across, the thing that I advise leaders all the time is in any conversation you're going into, whether it's with a customer or it's with the media especially, know what the number one thing is that you're trying to get across, right? The thing that if they understand nothing else from what you've said, they've walked away with that one nugget, and do everything in your power to convey that and to do it really tightly. Actually practice a little bit figuring out what is that really tight line that I'm going to say. Figure out where you stand and then actually stand there. This is ultimately a point that, covers a number of different contexts. And you've got to be able to say, if people are able to walk away with the thing that they need to remember, it's got to be repeatable. It's got to be tight and impactful, and it's got to actually say something that might inspire some filter through which they can see other things. And that is, I think, the construct you want to operate with when you're conveying your ultimate points.
Well, and it's helpful to learn how to answer the unasked question.
That's exactly right.
Because a lot of times a reporter won't ask you the question you'd really like to address, but you can learn to segue from one question into one they didn't ask and give an answer that's a lot more interesting than the answer to their question.
That's right. It's so true. Well, and I'll say this, like in the age of podcasts, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because it's a little bit longer form. We get to actually talk about what we mean with things. You still have to think through, how do we say, people expect authenticity. How do we say what we mean and show who we are in these contexts, but also not assume that someone's going to take the time to spend their entire 40, 60 minutes kind of hearing all of your thoughts. Sometimes they need to be able to say, I walked away with that and had a really great understanding of the conversation, but the two things that stuck with me were, what are those two things? And are they what you thought they would be going in, right? Really kind of do that mapping exercise and understand, like, what are the things I want to convey, but also how do I show people who I am in these conversations as well? Because people remember what they feel coming out of them as well. Oh,
for sure. Sounds like Maya Angelou to me.
Yeah. She got this.
Yes, boy, she nailed it, didn't she? Now, Bradley, you tell a beautiful story about Reverend Jesse Jackson diffusing a tense 15,000 person crowd with a single sentence. Tell us that story and tell us what we can take from it as communicators. Yeah. I mean, the level of trust and credibility that comes with the decades of work that he, put into civil rights and to building community is evident. But I think also one of the things that was so magnetic about him is that he has this level of credibility and gravitas in every communication that really just comes through. I mean, it's amazing. So we were in Chicago at an immigrants' rights rally. This was back in 2010. There were about 15,000 people, as you noted, that were there, and Reverend Jackson was one speaker. I was there with him, and the only other person that was with us was his security detail. And so after Reverend Jackson got off the stage, we walked with him off the stage. What naturally happens when you're with a guy like Reverend Jesse Jackson is that the crowd sees where he's going, and that's where they go. He was not the final speaker on the stage. And so when he walked off the stage and we kind of sauntered over to the road, what ended up happening was thousands of people started pouring from out of the crowd and started to come behind him, assuming that the march was just about to begin. He's walking, we're marching. And what was really, really disturbing after that is one of the organizers who was frustrated knowing how many other speakers were coming does the most chaotic thing you can do in this moment, which is grab a bullhorn and start shouting that he is trying to split the crowd. And that one is not at all what he was trying to do. No. Just, taking a walk to gather our thoughts. Number two, instantly, all of these people who have just walked are now saying, oh, well, what do we do now? And so now they've stopped. And you don't just stop 15,000 people
dead. You have, people that start to crowd around. And so all of a sudden, within seconds, we're in the dead center, surrounded by these 15,000 people who are around us in the streets of downtown Chicago. Now people are confused. Now some people are angry. Some people are, upset that they found themselves in this situation. It's hot. People are really starting to say, okay, what's going on here? And Reverend Jackson's security turns to me and says exactly the thing you imagine I want to hear. He looks me in the eye and says, if anything happens, I'm only here to protect one person. That wasn't me. Newsflash.
Yeah.
So in this moment, I'm freaking out and I think, what's going to happen here? It's a powder keg. And Reverend Jackson just straightens his back, stands tall, looks people directly in the eye, and with this just level of absolute calm says, okay, everyone calm down. Let's walk back to the stage and listen to the rest of the speakers. And amazingly, one, he projects very well. It's impressive that many people were able to hear him. But two, people just kind of said, okay, you know what? Let's do that. And he just starts walking and the crowd starts parting and people follow him, but follow him right back to the area. He goes back to the stage and sits down on the corner of the stage so that everyone listening can see that he supports the speakers that are up there. And we had a really, really great rally. And what I take away from that moment is all of us as leaders have to think through, what are the things that we are doing? What are the things that we're saying? And how are we saying those things such that we inspire trust? Because trust is built not just in these moments, but over time. And when people are able to actually see, this is a person who says what they mean, does what they say, and in these moments, these crucible moments, is able to lead us to a destination, 9 times out of 10, they're willing to follow. But you've got to give them something to rally around.
Well, there was a heavy dose of personal humility there, too.
That's critical.
A lot of people, I think, at least in today's world, might have thought, well, cool, I've said my part, they're following me, and these other speakers, they don't have much to say anyway. They might not have literally said that, but their behavior might have said that. So,
yeah. Well, and people are watching your actions as much as your words, so that's huge.
For sure. Well, now, you argue that in an AI-saturated world, authentic human emotion has become more credible, not less. How does a CEO show that kind of emotion without being accused of performance?
There is a Pepperdine professor who actually wrote about this concept of intellectual humility. I read a little bit about this for an Inc. column, and I think in this moment, intellectual humility is really important. So what does that mean? It means being able to convey a thought or idea with conviction, but also leave very, very clear openness to having your mind change, right? I think it's so often today that people come into conversations with a point of view and they're so stubbornly rigid. We can't actually find compromise because we're talking past each other. And what should be moments of figuring out, well, what are the core things about my argument that I want to keep, but what can I actually learn? I mean, you said this right at the beginning of our conversation today. We always want to keep learning. If people lose that sense of wanting to be able to learn and shift the way they see their world based on a new perspective that's presented to them, people see that and they're going to lose trust in you quickly. And why are they going to follow someone who believes it's their way or the highway, right?
Yeah. We learn the most from people who disagree with us.
That's right.
I mean, you don't learn a lot in an echo chamber.
You sure don't. That's exactly right. So, I mean, look, if you are a leader who is operating in this environment, then heed that, right? And say, how do I expand my aperture? How do I constantly want to learn and demonstrate a willingness to learn from other people's perspectives, but also have a point of view? People want to follow someone who can articulate a vision, but if they're able to then show, I have updated and informed my way of thinking based on these new inputs, people actually feel there's worthwhile benefit to engaging with this person, and I actually can follow them because I can trust that where they're going is reflective of what they're learning along the way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, finally, Bradley, what gives you hope about the future of corporate communication? What do you see out there that brings hope to you?
Well, there's a couple of things, but I think maybe the most important thing is that reputation is being understood in ways that it hasn't really ever before. I mean, this is a moment for communicators. And I think that's really, really important as we think about structures of organizations and what it looks like to lead from the communications seat. And part of that is because the risks that have been proposed and really kind of put in front of us by this technological advancement, the information proliferation we've talked about, the speed and the pace, it actually works for us as much as or more than it works against us. Right? Mm-hmm. We have more tools at our disposal to be able to personalize how we communicate with people around us, right? We no longer have to say, oh, well, we don't have time to tailor a message to our employees because this news is moving fast. Well, actually, now we do. Let's take that external communication we've put out to talk to a reporter and very quickly tailor that, through the tools that are at our disposal to make sure that our employees understand this information and get it first so they're not surprised externally. Let's make sure that our leaders have, a nuanced view of what do our community members think in this community versus another community, and how do we tailor how we talk about the same core message based on meeting them where they're at. How do we do all of these things at speed and at scale, and with a level of not just, using AI, for example, to create a point of view, but really take our point of view that is authentic to us and amplify that point of view so that people are able to actually now have greater access to our individuals and to our values and our strategy than we have at any other point. These are really important things, and they're accessible to us now. And if we do our jobs right, we're actually going to be able to expand our impact meaningfully in ways that we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago.
For sure. Well, Bradley, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. I really hope our listeners have taken notes. If they didn't, I hope they'll listen again and take some notes. Great content. Bradley's book lands like a fire alarm in a building most leaders don't even know is burning. The old crisis playbook, deliberate, measured, defensive, is over. What replaces it is faster, messier, and far less forgiving. A world where silence reads as guilt, neutrality looks like cowardice, and a single TikTok could cast you as a villain by sundown. Bradley's message is bracing and oddly hopeful. Trust is still king. Conviction still beats waffling. And the leaders willing to step into the storm with clear values and a direct voice will win the day. The real test may not be whether you can speak in a crisis, but whether people already believe you when you do. Share this episode with your friends and associates. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that Leadership provides. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.